So before we jump into the word, just please join me in prayer. Father God, we just thank you again just for continuing to be in our lives. God, we just thank you for all that you've done this week, all the things that we were able to see you do, and all the things that we were not. God, we know how powerful your love is and how you're continuing every second of our lives to be working on our hearts, working on the ground in front of us, and preparing the path that you want us to walk. And so we just pray that we're able to just open our hearts today to you, to continue to see your words and your love, and just continue to trust you more and look to you more and more. And so we just pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we're continuing in Psalm 119. And so we're going to be looking at the next stanza, verses 73 through 80. So it's there with you on the handouts. You guys can just read it with me or on the screens. It says, "Your hands have made and fashioned me. Give me understanding that I may learn your commandments. Those who fear you shall see me and rejoice, because I have hoped in your word. I know, O Lord, that your rules are righteous, and that in faithfulness you have afflicted me. Let your steadfast love comfort me, according to your promise to your servant. Let your mercy come to me, that I may live, for your law is my delight. Let the insolent be put to shame, because they have wronged me with falsehood. As for me, I will meditate on your precepts. Let those who fear you turn to me, that they may know your testimonies. May my heart be blameless in your statutes, that I may not be put to shame." And so as we've been going through Psalm 119, right, there's a lot about following God's directions, loving his commands, loving his rules, because they really set up the life that you're supposed to live, right? It is all about following God. And so here he's saying the same thing. Like, if I follow what you say, I will have this understanding, and I will be living with this hope that you want me to have, right? And there's even this section where he says, like, even when he's struggling, right, even when he's suffering, he'll know it's for a good reason, and he'll still delight in it, right? He'll be comforted by God's love. And so for all of us, that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, right? Getting the understanding from God that allows us to understand all the good things that are happening and also all the bad things that are happening, right? Even being able to celebrate them no matter what's going on, being able to sing these words, being able to really have this in our heart. I love this last song, right? I could sing of your love forever. Most of the time we only sing about God's love and really celebrating with him is after we've gotten the answer, after we've gotten delivered, after we've gotten exactly what we asked for. But while we're waiting, when we were first thinking about it, are we singing about his love like that, right? Knowing, God, I know you've promised you're going to take care of this. I know you said you always got me. I'm going to sing of your love before, during, after. That's what forever means. Does that make sense? Forever is not after you've done it, I'm going to sing about you. That's not what that word can mean. Does that make sense? Because even right now, we're singing about his love forever because of something he's done already. But we know that there's still future challenges that are going to come, right? So if we're going to be singing about his love forever, we should be doing it right now about what he's going to do for the things that we don't even know is coming. Does that make sense? And so this is where this psalmist is writing about that, where it's like, I've seen what you've done before. I trust you, and I'm continuing to know that the understanding that comes from you is something that cannot be matched. And that's why I'm writing this. This is why I'm bearing my heart to you. Does that make sense? So hopefully after today, you guys will kind of have that feeling like, I will always know God's going to give me understanding, and I'm going to celebrate while I'm waiting for that understanding. All right, and so we're going to look at some kind of clues to see how this happens, right? Because the psalmist writes this, and some of the stuff that we've known that happens to the characters kind of give us clues, right? And so one of the first things is that the first point, we must trust God over everything else to give us understanding. The very first sentence tells us why we should have this belief, right? Your hands have made and fashioned me. Nobody knows you better than God. Nobody knows every gift you have. Nobody knows every single ability, every single weakness that you have. Only God does. Does that make sense? Only God knows how all of that's going to come together. God's the one that knows how you're going to grow past it, how you're going to be able to use every experience, right? Even the struggles, even the mistakes, how you're somehow going to get better, right? Most people can only theorize. Most people can only guess. Most people will be like, well, based on my experience or what I've seen, this is what I think is this, or this is what I think you can do. Does that make sense? But that is nothing. They don't know you. They only know what you've shown them. Does that make sense? And even a lot of times you don't even know yourself yet. You're still fully learning things, right? You're still being developed. And so this is where it's kind of like the only one that could really give you the understanding, the best understanding is God. Does that make sense? Because of that, that's one sentence. He made and fashioned you. If you know that, if you believe that, then you will have that, you will put God's messages above everything else. Does that make sense? That's where it's kind of like, if he's the one that knows me the best, I need everything to fall under him. So even all the people that he put in my life, all the people that he's given to help me grow, whatever they say still must come under what God said. Does that make sense? If they say this or I can't do this, I still must take it to God. I still must find out what God says about it, what he says I have or what I can't do, right? That's what it comes down to, having that first level. Because if you don't put him first, then your understanding will always be skewed by how much value you put in what he said, right? So, but that's why I said, hopefully you understand that and let that sink in, right? He can give you the best understanding. The way he does this, he pretty much follows the same formula. God gives you clues all the time to help you understand how he made you, what you're made for, and how he's going to help you do it, right? He gives you clues all the time. This is where in the psalm it said, hope in your word, right? Because the words they've gotten, they put hope in it based on what has already been revealed. And they're now believing in what's next, right? But it always came from previous experience, previous things that he's already done. The characters in the Bible have patterns of revelations that build up their confidence in doing what God tells them. We see a lot of these characters where they did all these great things, and we think, man, it must have just been instant, right? We can read the story in 2 to 3 minutes, and we're like, man, they just had it, they got it, and they just went and did it. That's not how these characters worked. Most of them had to wait years, right? There's characters that waited 7, 13, 25 years just to do what God made them to do. Does that make sense? And so as we're reading it, it's fast for us, but it took a long time for them. But the Bible records every little detail to help you understand what God was giving them all along to get to that point. Does that make sense? That's where I said, like, a lot of us don't know the clues that are given. Some of us don't even think about what was actually there, right? So we're going to look at a character to kind of help you understand this and see how did we miss these clues and why do we miss them, right? And how do we get better at finding clues? And so it's important to understand, right? The clues are in the story for a reason. We should focus on them more. God was very specific on how he wrote everything. If you just breeze through the story and you don't have the understanding, that's on you. Does that make sense? Because God put it in there. And God's the one telling you, pay attention to all these things. Look what I'm doing. It's meant to show you how I'm going to do it for you. Does that make sense? And so that's where you have to understand. If God is giving us everything, he knows us the best, and he knows the clues. He put the clues for us to find. He wants us to know them. All right, so the story that we're going to look at is David today. Most of us all know David pretty well, right? Everybody knows that story. They probably read it 3 or 4 times. When David is going to fight Goliath, what is the clue given to us in the Bible that tells us why David believed he could beat Goliath? What's some guesses? How did David know he could beat Goliath? Based on the story that you read. Was it just a random thought that God gave him? Is there something that you know a detail of in that story? I don't put it on the handout this time. I made it harder for you guys for a reason. All right? I'm trying to test what you guys got. If you're a Sunday school teacher and they don't get it, you guys, we'll take them outside. All right, what is the clue? How come David knew to take down Goliath? What do you guys think? Any guesses? What's that? Lions and bears? Okay, that's a good guess. That's one of the clues. Anything? Anybody else? Any other guesses? Israel's God's chosen people? Very close. I like it. You're right on the cusp. Right on the cusp. There was a specific clue. The first sentence that David gives when he sees Goliath and hears Goliath talking, there's a clue in that first sentence that he gives, but nobody thinks about it. Anybody have any ideas? All right. So I'll make it easy for you guys. The first thing that he says when Goliath goes on a rant about God and blasphemes his name, he says, "Who is this uncircumcised Gentile putting down my God?" So he says this twice. Who is this uncircumcised person? It's kind of a weird word. Obviously, we don't, that's where a lot of people just breeze through it. But when he says that, that's his first reaction. And there's a reason why that's his reaction. Kind of what you said. To be circumcised meant you had a covenant with God. You were blessed. You were protected. Does that make sense? You had everything because you were part of God's promise. So the fact that this person is not part of that covenant, he should not have that kind of confidence. Does that make sense? So this is where David's kind of like, I have more confidence than him because of the fact that I'm circumcised. The fact that I am part of God's covenant. I am part of God's people. This man cannot stand in front of me and say this. This man cannot stand in front of God and say this. Does that make sense? So that's the first clue right there. The fact that he knows he is not part of God's people means he cannot beat David. Right? That's the first clue that we get. So when David asks this question, like, who is he, right? David kind of says, like, what's the reward for taking him out? Right? So some people are laughing, like, I can't believe this little kid is saying, asking what the reward is, like he's going to do something. So they end up, his brother gets mad at David for saying this, and then the rumors get spread around where it goes all the way up to Saul. Right? They're like, there's this little kid saying that, who's this uncircumcised guy? How can he do this? Right? Let's take him out. And so that's where David goes in front of Saul. And that's where what Margaret brought up. He asked him, what makes you think you can do this? And he says, let me tell you, when I was a shepherd with my flock, lions and bears took away my sheep. I went after them and took them back out of their mouth and slayed them. Right? I slayed the lion, I slayed the bear. God helped me slay the lion. God helped me slay the bear. And God's going to help me slay this uncircumcised Gentile. This is in 1 Samuel 17, if you guys are curious about it. All right? That was his words to Saul. And that's where we see the clues now coming together. The first clue was he's uncircumcised. The next clue is, who God was, what he's done, and then now what he's done through David. Right? So you can see the clues lining up, each one in one. And so now he's basically telling the king, I can take him down because God will do this. He doesn't say, I'm going to do it. He says, God will do this. Does that make sense? So that's where we see the way the clues were working through that story. So now when David, then they agree and they put the armor on him, right? It doesn't fit him. It's too big. This is where we see the clues of who David is, how he fought, all this stuff that God had made him to be, right? He fashioned him. He's like, I don't need, because, that might discourage you, right? If you put on a soldier's armor and you can't even carry it, you might be like, man, I'm way over my head. Does that make sense? But David already got the other three clues saying, no, I'm God's chosen people. I'm God's chosen one. And God's already done. I didn't have armor to take a lion and bear down. I don't need it based on what God has shown me, right? So this is where he takes it off. And he's got that now, the identity solid. Does that make sense? Based on the clues he's already gotten. And so now the clue, he's ready to go. Does that make sense? And that's where we know the story. He then goes and takes down Goliath. And this is why that story is important. The clues were in David's life. They're shown to us, right? If David is part of Israel, they know about the giants, right? This is after Moses led them to the Israelites out of Egypt. When they first went to the promised land, right? They were too afraid of the giants back then. The only two that believed that they could go in, Joshua and Caleb, God made sure they went into the promised land. Does that make sense? So David knows this history, right? More clues at why he could do this. Those that were afraid of the giants never inherited what God promised. Those that did got to go in. So this is where David's saying, like, giants have already scared our people away once. This giant is scaring our people for 40 straight days, right? And he's like, but now God brought me here to take them down, right? And that's where David's like, I know from all these clues God has given me, personally, through revelation, through history, my people's history, right? I can do this. And so that's what we're trying to see. Like, God, when we say God gives us understanding, that's how he does it. Through multiple clues, right? But how many of you knew that detail was in there? Not really, right? And this is where it's kind of important to understand. Most of us probably read the story as a kid or had it read to us as a kid, right? They love to teach this in the Sunday schools when they're very young. David slays the Goliath, all this. So as you've read it maybe as a kid, then in high school, then in college, then maybe as an adult, you know the ending, so you breeze through the whole story, right? David had this faith. He was able to not be afraid. He believed in God. He took on the giant. And then that's all we go, right? We just brush through the story because we think we know the details, because we know the story. And so that's where we miss all that God put in there. Does that make sense? So that's where you have to look at those characters, look at them slowly, and understand every clue that's there, right? Because that's why I said it's repeated over and over. He keeps saying that, the uncircumcised person, right? And so that's why I said if you really read it, you would understand. Why does that word keep popping up? What does that have to do with him wanting to take down a giant? Does that make sense? But that's where we see, like, all those people that were not part of God's people, right? Egypt, right? The kings, the pharaohs, all those people, all the kings when they were traveling, they were all uncircumcised. They all went down. Does that make sense? That's what that meant. That word meant to these people of Israel. That's what it was supposed to inspire in them, right? But none of them had it, and this is why David was special, right? But David looked at all the clues and understood what he was supposed to do, right? Because we'll get into this in another week, but it's one thing to understand, there's another thing to actually go do it. Does that make sense? So today we're just only focusing on how to get the understanding. Once we get that, usually then it's a lot easier to kind of be bold for God, right? But this is where I feel like this is the step that is needed, right? But it's important to understand God gives you the clues, right? So the thing that we need to apply and understand is you got to work on the clues given to you already, all right? So like I said, you're looking at this story in the 3 minutes reading all of David, right? But he had a progress to his life he was working clue by clue by clue. Does that make sense? When he's first there, he's obedient to his father. He's taking care of the sheep, right? He's learning about God as a young child, right? As he's then learning as a young child, he then starts to protect the flock. He starts being responsible for it. Does that make sense? So this is where that story came between the lion and the bear. Then we see him get anointed by Samuel, right? Like he knows there's something special about him, right? He sees this. Then the next step, the father tells him, hey, go keep bringing food to your brothers day after day. Does that make sense? So that's his next clue. He keeps going in the direction his father's telling him. He's learning to be obedient to his father, right? And that's what I said. On the 40th day, somehow David is there at the right time when Goliath finally speaks. Does that make sense? Goliath has been speaking 40 days, but the timing was never there. David wasn't there and hearing him the other days. Does that make sense? So this is where we see, like, the clue for David. He's doing what he's supposed to. He's being where he's supposed to be. And then all of a sudden he hears it. See how that each step, David is continuing to grow and do what he knows is right. Does that make sense? Working on what's given to him. And so this is where it kind of ends in the very end of this stanza. May my heart be blameless in your statutes. Right? So this is where David is kind of establishing that pattern. Like, you got to be faithful in the little things that he gives you. Right? Every little clue that he gives you, work on that. They'll lead you to the bigger picture. But I think most of us, we want the big picture right away. Would you guys agree? Who wants the big picture? Who flips to the back of a book to see the ending before they read it? Is there anybody here? Andy? All right, a couple people. All right. Right? I don't know, maybe you guys don't want to admit it, but there's a lot of people that do that, right? There's a lot of people that will read the synopsis of a movie before they ever watch it, right? Or a TV show. Is it worth watching? Let me see the reviews, what people said. I'm like, man, just go in it, right? Go in fresh, right? But some people, they got to know, is it worth my time? Or is like, you want a big picture before you ever commit anything, right? And so this is where it's kind of like, it's important to understand you don't want the whole picture if you're not ready for it, right? If you're not really ready to understand what all the sacrifices are going to pay off or how they're going to actually do all these things, a big picture can actually harm you if you're not mature enough. Does that make sense? And so this is where God knows us, fashioned us, understands. He always gives us the amount of understanding that we need based on where we're at in our growth. He never gives you more. He gives you every piece clue by clue because he knows you very well. And so I think about this because I had a lot of people, like, I've worked with a lot of Christians like that. They're like, they think big picture and they see all these stuff and they're like, oh, I could do this or I could do that, right? For me, when I was in seminary, I got my tuition paid for, I got money for housing, and all my books was covered, right, from the Army. So I was living pretty fat for that. I didn't have to work at all. I was set. I could just volunteer at any church I wanted. That's pretty much what I was doing. So a lot of my classmates, they had to work a full-time job, do a full-time ministry, and have kids, right? And then they also had to do full-time school. And so some of them were kind of upset how easy my life was. And they even let me know it. Joaquin, I can't believe how easy it is for you. I can't believe how much you have like free time, right? Like, and so some of them were like, I don't know why God would bless you. God doesn't even believe in the army. God doesn't want his Christians to serve in war. How come he's blessing you, not me? Right? They're like, sometimes some people looked at it as an insult, the fact that how well I was taken care of. And so I could get mad, or I could kind of work my way, right? Work my magic. So I was like, all right, let me talk to you. And so I'll tell them, if you want my life, if you want the blessings I have, and they're like, yeah, I wish it would be that easy for me. I was like, I'll tell you everything that I went through, and then you can tell me if you'd want to follow my steps, right? And I told them, I guarantee you will not want it after I tell you what I went through. And so as I start listing off all the stuff, right, because some of them are like, go ahead, I bet you I could. They're like, you seem so happy. You're always laughing, smiling, joking around. It must not have been that hard for you in the army, or you must not have been in the danger zones, all this other stuff. It's like, all right, watch, right? And so as I started telling them stories, I never even made it halfway through, and they're like, no, you're right. I would not want that. That is terrible. That is too hard. Does that make sense? And so for some of them, they're like, you're right. I don't want those blessings. I'd rather do this hard life right now than to go through what you went through. Some of the, so, I was like, all right, at least, I got some respect now from them. At least they have some understanding, right? Some people, they're like, well, what does that mean? Are you trying to brag like you're stronger than us? And I was like, no, don't you get it? God had that plan for me. My whole life, all the things that I went through, even as a kid, all this stuff, right? All the violence, death stuff, even when I was just a middle school teenager. And it was like, all those things were building me up for the next challenge. God knew all the gifts that he gave me, how he made me, what I needed for my whole life to prepare me for those episodes. So it's not who I am. It's not just because of who I am. It's what God did, right? I was like, there's all these other Christians in this school with us that have all kinds of crazy journeys that are hard, that have been like just digging their hands into the dirt for what they had to get. And I've heard their stories. I've heard what they had to go through. I could not do what they did. I could not go through the challenges that they went through. And I was like, and that's the whole point, because God knew who they were. God gave them their gifts, their certain personalities, and God developed their life to be able to do what they were going to do. Does that make sense? And that's what I said, like they got all the clues, all the steps from God. Anybody that comes from the side that never got any of those things will look at that and be like, no way do I want that. Does that make sense? And so that's why I said, like, the big picture, it seems like it's going to help you, but it will not help you because you are not ready for it right now. Does that make sense? And that's where God understands. I do not want to give you more to where you'll quit. You'll give up because it's too hard, right? I'm glad, I love everything God gave me. And that's why, but I love his plan. I understand that, where it's like, he gave me every clue. This is why it's a perfect plan. This is why that first step is for me. God has the best knowledge. He can give the best understanding. Does that make sense? He used all those steps. And so this is where it's important to understand for all those characters. Imagine if David, right? If God told David, you're going to be fleeing for your life for all these years. You're going to have to trust the king's son to protect your life. Right? Not even your own flesh and blood. The king's flesh and blood is going to have to protect you. You're going to have all these things happen. Do you think David would have wanted to then go and fight Goliath and take those steps? Right? If he was 13, some of you guys are in high school, when God told you you're going to have to suffer all that David did, would you go take on a giant? How many of you would take on a giant right now? Right? I always talk about this. Like, what if a giant walked into the youth group? You ready to take his head off? No, everybody's like, no. Right? But this is what we talk about. Like, for the most part, like, if you see a big picture, when you don't know what the full strength of God or what he can do, you would not do it. You would be hesitant, or you would think God is cruel for making you do that. Right? So this is why I said it's important to understand you're being influenced to want bigger picture, but in reality, even if you have big picture, you still got to work on it one step at a time. Does that make sense? And that's what God's saying. Just work on it one step at a time. Right? Because everything you do is accomplished step by step. And this is why we should actually celebrate that God only gives us one step at a time. Right? This is where it's like, if you do math, right? Let's go to the VBS right now. Let's go take some calculus homework to them. Right? And say, hey, do this right now. You're going to have to do this by the time you finish high school. Start right now. How many of them you think will start crying? Like, if you can't leave here, you can't eat until you finish this homework. How many of those kids will start crying? Right? You'd be like, you have to learn how to do this. Right? And they'd be, right? Because why? It's way too much for them. But if you take them a little bit of math at their level right now and have that plan for the next 7 years, hey, this is what's going to get you to calculus. They would enjoy doing every single step. Does that make sense? And they would be proficient at it. That's why schools do that process, because you have to work on it step at a time. And so instead of being angry at God for only giving you one step at a time, you should actually be celebrating. He doesn't give me more than I can handle right now. He doesn't force me to grow at this pace that is not healthy for me. Does that make sense? He does not force me to go into these results that it has to happen at this time or by this pace. Does that make sense? I appreciate what you were sharing. Where that's why I said, like, everything else was kind of like, there's always this pressure where it's like, you got to do it at this point, this level, all this stuff. You're supposed to be proficient from the day you graduate. Or all this type of stuff where it's like, no, everybody's grown. There's a reason why professionals get better and better and better. Does that make sense? That's what's needed. Nobody can handle it when they're first starting things out. And so that's why I said, like, you should actually celebrate how much God loves you and the fact that he's so patient, he will only give you one step at a time to make sure that you're going to be rock solid. Does that make sense? Because that's where I look at it. It's kind of like he's building your foundation with those steps, knowing that you can be built up higher and higher and higher if he spends more time on your foundation. that make sense? So some of you might think, I wish it was already built up, but he's like, I can build you up even more if you allow me to build a bigger foundation. Does that make sense? You guys know, like, I don't think anybody's like designed to be an architect or stuff like that, but that's how construction works, right? The higher the building you want to build, the wider and deeper you got to build the foundation. So it takes you a lot longer to build the building up. Most of the time, all your construction goes straight down and out. Does that make sense? Because it's got to be able to support the building going all the way up. And so this is where we kind of see if God's actually slow with you and building you step by step, and you don't see a lot of progress, that you can be like, man, God's going to build me deep. God's going to build it high. Does that make sense? That's why I say, like, you're actually supposed to celebrate what he's doing. And so I'll try to run you through this my own scenario, right, in this, where how God has done this, right? Trusting him first, looking at the clues, and then working on what he gave you. For me, I think one of this process really worked very well for me and was very foundational for ministry when I faced the first death in ministry, right? So obviously I came from the military background. Death was a part of our life all the time. I was very comfortable with it. It's very understandable, right? My dad was from Vietnam, all that stuff. My uncles all fought in all the wars. That was easy. Ministry is a little different, right? Because people die in a whole nother scenario. So the first ministry death that happened was actually this kid I was working with. She was in 7th grade and her mom died, right? So I'll give you the whole background behind this story. Basically, I started this children's group in this church in San Francisco. I worked with 3rd grade through 8th grade. Right, so a couple of the kids, one of the kids would become my future niece. She went to this Catholic school, private school. She used to play volleyball, and so as we were trying to get this group started, right, we were like, okay, there's a good 8 kids that are interested in this. So we started this group, and so we were doing what I do here, right, food, games, things like that. So they end up inviting me to their harvest festival at their school, right? They're like, we're doing a fundraiser for our sports teams and things like that. They're like, you're really good at all these carnival games, right? Like, you think you could show up to our carnival and win us some stuff, right? They're like, we never win. I was like, all right, I got you. And so when I showed up to this harvest festival, they had all these different games. They're like, find which one you can really clean up on. And so there's this game called ladder ball. I don't know if you guys know it, but basically it's like these 3 little tiers where it's called the bolo, 2 balls with a string on it, right? So you have to toss it and wrap it around these poles. And so it's the game I'm really good at. And so the Boy Scouts of San Francisco created this huge monstrosity, right? Like this kind of beast where it had like all these arms and it had like this huge head, right? So if you got the bolo on the arm, you got a point and a ticket. And then they had this little box on top of its head that had hundreds of tickets, right? And so I was like, all right. And so this is where you can win the most. And it was my favorite game. So I'm like, all right, I got you guys. So the first round I threw it and I got them on all the arms, right? And I was like, all right. So I was like, my aim is locked in. I'm ready. I'm gonna start taking out that box off the head. And so, all right. So I go and I start just chucking it. Bam, first one, knock it right off the head, right? So I ended up knocking off 16 out of 18. Because they would keep refilling this box, right? So we're just cleaning up on tickets. And so there's this one little girl, her name was Carly, right? A 7th grader, the friend of my niece. And so she was like, wow, like, I've been losing at all the games. You think you could help me too? Right? And so this girl, I had a little bit of history with her from the summer. They had a summer camp at this church for all the kids. And this girl was like mean, never followed any rules, right? Like she pretty much got kicked out of the camp. Because she was like, her and the girls were like messing with the soap and like, jamming up all the sinks, right? And this girl just didn't want to listen to anybody. She did not care. And so I was like, man, I'm glad she doesn't go to our church. Like that girl is a nightmare, right? But here in this harvest festival, she's just like, hey, can you help me? Right? And so I know who God made me. I always help people, whether they're my friends or my enemies, right? Same way, I always do the same thing. So I'm like, all right, if I'm helping my kids, I'll gladly help you, right? So I took her tickets and did the same thing. Bam, started knocking the thing off the head. Right? And so I got her all these tickets. So we ended up winning like 22 stuffed animals, right? And so they gave them out to some of the kids. She got one. They gave me a little bear I have at home, right? And so this girl was like, how did you get so good at all these games? And I was like, oh, we do them at church, right? Like this is part of our little children's program. Like we do games and Bible lessons. And so the friends, my niece was like, hey, you should come, right? Like it's a lot of fun. You should come to the youth group. And so she's like, okay, yeah, I want to check it out. So this was like her introduction. This is her process to coming. So she came one Friday. She was like, okay, it's pretty cool. She came a second time. So the second time she came, I was actually doing a lesson on honoring your parents, right? And so I was talking to them about how why God has that in place. Why is it important? And so I was asking them like, why is it hard to honor your parents? And so the kids gave a lot of reasons, and some of them were like, they don't want to have any fun, right? They're always like afraid we're going to get hurt. And so one of the kids was like, how come our parents aren't like you? You're always trying to have fun with us. You don't care if we get hurt. Like you do all kinds of dangerous stuff with us, right? Like it's such a blast. right? And so as they're saying this, they're like, how come they can't do what you do? And I was like, first of all, I was like, I don't have a job. I don't have no kids, right? I was like, I have all the time in the world just to play and have fun. I was like, your parents are working for you, providing shelter, food, all your sports, all your extracurricular activities, right? They got to make sure you do all your homework, all this other stuff, right? So I was like, all the time that they have to spend taking care of you I was like, it wears them out, right? And so I was like, there's a reason why they can't do what I do. It's like, if I had to do any of what your parents had to do, I was like, I'd be angry all the time. Like, I'd be tossing you guys around, right? Like, I would not be fun if I had to do all that. And so I was like, you guys should actually be thanking your parents for what they're doing, right? Because I was like, even your parents now, they drop you off and they're waiting in the cars or, hour and a half, 2 hours just for you guys to have fun, right? And so I was like, I can't do anything that I do without them, right? I was like, it is all because of them that we can even have fun. And I was like, you guys should actually thank them and really understand what they're doing for you. And so the kids were like, okay, like, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense, right? So I made the application for that lesson. Thank your parents tonight for always making sure you can have fun, right? And doing all the things that you love to do. And so this girl, Carly, when her mom came to pick her up, she actually told her, like, Mom, thank you. I'm sorry for always giving you a hard time. I just want to thank you for bringing me here and always doing the things that you're doing for me, right? So it was this great moment between the mom and the daughter. And so as they walk off, right, the daughter kind of like hugs her mom and they just walk off like this sweet little setting, right? I was like, oh, that's cool. Like, they're having a good moment. So later that night, the mom of that girl, Carly, she texted my niece's mom. And so, she let me know, like, oh, the mom was like shocked. Like, she's like, you must have taught like the best lesson ever, right? Like her kid was so like thankful and like, it was such a bonding moment. And so the mom had shared, like, for the last 6 months, that girl Carly was like just a nightmare. Like, she was like being rebellious, constantly disobeying her mom, like constantly breaking every rule she could. Does that make sense? So she had made like the last 6 months like a living hell for the mom. And so she was like, it's just like night and day all of a sudden, right? And so she's like, the mom was a devout Christian as well. She's like, thank God for changing my daughter's heart. And so that Saturday, they end up having like this huge mother-daughter day, right? They go all over San Francisco doing all kinds of activities, right? They're just having a blast, like having the time of their lives, making up for lost time. And so the reason why I know this is because Saturday night, her mom actually passed away. Her heart gave out. Mom was probably about only 46. So when her mom passed away, right, that's when my future sister-in-law, she basically told me, right, like, yeah, like they were doing all these things and now she died. And so at the time, the girl had no local family. They were all isolated here in San Francisco. So the girl had nobody to look after her or anything. So thankfully, my sister-in-law, she took her in for a little bit, right? Like, we'll take her in, we'll try to figure this out. But obviously this girl is devastated and she don't know what to do. Even myself, I'm like, what the heck? Like, how do you even handle this? And so this is my first experience in it. And I was ill-equipped, to say the least, to talk to a girl that just lost her mom, right? I did not know what to say. All the death that I experienced was based in a military context. I could talk to parents that lost their kids. I could talk to spouses that lost their spouse. I could talk to children that lost their parents in war. I knew how to say that. I knew what to say. What do you say to somebody that just lost somebody here in the States? You know what I mean? It's like, I did not think that through. I did not know what to say, right? So I was talking to God over and over. I was like, God, why did this happen? What to do, right? Like, why, what's going on, right? Like, why is this going on? I could always make sense of the deaths that we went through. This one, I had no clue where to even start. Does that make sense? I was like, God, I know how to figure out a lot of stuff. I was like, this is the first time I'm flat-footed. I don't even know how to even step forward. And I even step to the side, like I'm stuck. Right, so I was starting to work through all the possibilities. What can I do? What does God want me to do? And so the best thing I could come up with was like, all right. I was like, I could adopt this girl, right, and raise her. I was like, just be like a foster parent, right? And so as I was saying that, I was like, all right, God, that's the best I could come up with. God's like, no. It's like, this girl has suffered enough, right? Like, she does not need you to raise her. I was like, right. I was like, you know me, God. You know me the best, right? And God's like, he's like, that's not the plan. Right, so they ended up being able to track one of her long-lost aunts in Michigan, right? So the aunt was like, oh yeah, like I'll be there, I'll come take care of her, right? And so the aunt was a great Christian as well. So it was a great thing for this girl, right? Like God was moving in this step. God was moving in this direction to try to take care of her. And so then I'm like, okay, God, like I'm glad for the girl, right? But what's the purpose of this? Why? How am I supposed to understand what to do out of this, right? And so I was like, God, what am I supposed to learn from this? And so God was like, do you know how to handle death? I was like, yes. He's like, where'd you learn it? I was like, Iraq. He's like, what happened? He's like, how did you learn to deal with death in Iraq? It's like, because of you. Like the first death that I saw was my first week there. This guy that does the bomb disposal, he got blown up. I was chosen to be on the funeral detail to honor him, right? So we ended up giving him a funeral in a castle in Iraq. So they had the guy in the courtyard, everything laid out. I did the 21 gun salute on the top of the towers, right? So it was like this cool setting, like the coolest setting I could ever imagine for somebody to be honored, a soldier to be honored. And so that's what helped give me that context. Like, this is important what we're doing. And so the way God gave me that first death and was allowed me to participate in it, I was like, everything else always had that lens. Like, we're doing this for a reason, right? And so I was like, God, you are the reason why I was able to handle everything that I did based on how you did that. And so he's like, so this first death as well should have some significance, that it's going to teach you something that you know you need, right? And it's something that's already been in you. And I'm like, okay. And so I was like, so what am I supposed to, what's the point of this death for the girl? And he's like, you're looking at it the wrong way. What's the point for the mom? And I was like, ooh. And he was like, if I knew the mom was going to die, what would be the most important thing for her for the last couple of days? For her to be able to be reconciled with her daughter, for her to be able to have that bond. Does that make sense? If God knew her time was up, what a great way to end her life, that she was able to be with her daughter, right? Have that time. Because for all those 6 months, it was just getting worse and worse, right? So this is where God said, like, I put you in place, doing what you do, just playing games, being silly, having fun, to be able to help build those steps for her. Does that make sense? He's like, you just did what you did, helping kids even though you don't even like them, right? Like, that's where he was like, you always treat people the same way. You played your part, and mom got what she needed. Does that make sense? And so he was like, she got to end her life on a positive. He's like, that's what I was worried about first, because her time was up. Then he's like, the second thing, the situation helped the daughter as well. Imagine if she was fighting with her mom for 6 months and her mom passed. Do you not think that she would have had a lot of guilt for the rest of her life? That she never said, she loved her mom or thanked her or anything like that? Does that make sense? Right? If somebody's taken away too soon, that's always what's in your mind. I should have said this. I wish I would have said, hug them before I left. Does that make sense? Like, there's a lot of people that have lost people early. They always go through those thoughts. And he was like, for her, it's a very tough situation that she lost her mom. No question. But at least she did not lose her during a period where they were angry at each other. Does that make sense? And I was like, I got you, God. That is true. I know that for a fact for what we went through, for what we go through, right? A lot of families, their kids are always angry at them when they're, we would do video calls back home. Kids would be yelling at their parents, I hate you, you're not here for my birthday, you're not here for Christmas. And they're over there fighting for their freedom, right? So you see these tough calls, and then they never come back. Those kids are always traumatized. So this is where I see God saying, like, all the experiences, all the clues that I've already given you are going to keep fueling you for this process, this step. Right, so now I know what to say to her. Now I know how to try to process. But also, at the same time, I also know what my job is for ministry. Right, understanding the deaths that I went through, it always gave me that charge. Like, every day is not promised. Live your day the best you can for God. That's what I've always wanted. That's what I love to do. Right, the war zones make you live that way. So when I went to ministry, I was always like, man, ministry is so boring. Like, it's not even exciting. There's no like death. There's no things that I love. Right? It's like, it's not high risk. There's not a lot of things that are going to get me to really want to work hard every day. And this is where that situation kind of gave it to me. It's like, don't you realize how many people go just like that? Right? How many people, this could be their last day in a church. This could be their last day, with their relationships, all these type of things. God's like, the pressure in this world is far greater than what you ever went back there. Does that make sense? It's like, that was a preparation, because the heartache that is going to be viewed in ministry is so much harder. I'm just building you up step by step. Does that make sense? And so this is where I said, God, okay. So he's like, you know what you're supposed to do in ministry. You know how I've built you as a kid and how I built you your whole life to live each day as a gift and to do your best, to go all out, give everything that day, right? So most of you see me do ministry, you know that's how we do it, right? How we cook, how we play games, like every single thing is like we do our best for that day. Does that make sense? And I love the fact that God has inspired me to do that. I don't think about the future. I don't have to think about how it's going to play out. I just know my role. I know my job. Give that best that day and teach people to do the same. Does that make sense? And that's where it's like, to be able to do that every single day, day after day, this is where you learn. You can't do it in your own strength. This is where the whole Jesus comes into that. Like, everybody would love to live that way, but you need Jesus' strength to get through all these things. You need it to be able to understand when those hardships come. Does that make sense? What I talked about earlier. How can you praise God and his love forever when you're going through all those things? Ministry, we face it a lot more, because we're dealing with a lot more people. And that's where God said, you're ready for it. I prepared you. I'm continuing to guide you, and you need to keep drawing to me. Does that make sense? If you're going to do every day I give you, keep drawing to me. And so that's why I said the clues, every single step, God guided me to this process, and to be able to handle that and be able to move in a positive direction. Does that make sense? And to be able to basically have my life call just after this one thing, right? And so that's why I said, like, obviously you guys aren't going to have the same calling, the same purpose, but hopefully you see, like, the God's plan never changes. He always has that same process. There's something usually that happens as a kid that he's going to keep building on it later on, right? And it's just going to keep getting deeper and deeper and deeper, clue after clue, step after step after step. Does that make sense? Because if I knew I had to work with all that kind of stuff that I would do in ministry when I was younger, I would have never started ministry, right? I would have never done this path if you asked me at 13, 14 years old, right? That's why I said, big picture, no way I would have ever done this. No way I would have ever done this. And so that's why I said, I thank God for knowing me the best and having that plan. And so hopefully you guys can see that for yourself. God, he understands you better than you ever will understand. He'll understand you better than anybody else, so you got to go after him. So the application steps are right there. You must seek God first to understand, right? That's a very general statement. I'm going to spend, the next application is where you can actually spend some time and start actually seeing, how do I seek God? So the step says, spend time reflecting where you are now, where you want to be. Ask God what his plan is. Is this what you should want? What his plan is to get you there? What does he want you to do in the waiting times? Does that make sense? See how those 4 things, they set up that first question. How do I seek God for everything? Those are the good 4 questions to keep asking God. Should I want this? What do you want? What's your plan? How long? And what do I do while I'm waiting? Does that make sense? And so as you're doing this, pray for the strength to keep being patient while you hope. This is not based on your strength. This is not based on how good you can be as a Christian. This is based on God's revelation and Jesus walking alongside you, right? So if you really want to understand and you want the strength to actually go out and do these steps, pray for the strength to be able to be patient and keep doing what he's telling you, right? And then the last one, talk to other believers to see how God helped them understand, to build up your own hope and skills in discerning what God wants, right? That's why I said, for me, I would talk to I love being in seminary because I would talk to all these Christians from all these different countries, all these different backgrounds. How did God give you clues? How did God lead you to this way? Does that make sense? I was brand new to the faith. I wasn't brand new to the faith. I was brand new to church. I was brand new to church ministry when I went to seminary, right? That was a whole new world for me. So I said, I'm going to be as hungry as I can and talk to all these people because they've been walking this journey a lot longer than I have. Let me hear how they did it. Let me see their clues so then I can find my own. That's how I found my clues for that story that I shared, based on what other ministers and people had shared with me. So that I encourage you to do the same. Talk to people and see how they got their clues, how they followed them, right? Learn because a lot of people have those struggles. I was so impatient. I started doing this other thing. But all of a sudden, 10 years down the road, that one step was always there. And then once I took it, everything went fast. Does that make sense? Like, listen to those stories, learn it. Read the stories again in the Bible. Read them slow, like I was sharing. Look at every single word in detail and understand why it's there, right? And then you'll be able to see a lot more in those stories. And I guarantee you, your own life will be unlocked a lot more because you'll think like, hey, did this happen? Did this happen? Right? Even asking my parents, I'll be like, why do you think I do this? Or why do you think I do that? And they're like, oh man, you've been doing this your whole life, or this and that, right? Like they have those stories. They've seen me a lot more. And so that's why I said it comes from actually talking to other people, using the people God gave you, God put around you. Does that make sense? But it's always submitting back to God under him, what understanding he's trying to give you. Does that make sense? So if he put people around you, he had a reason for it. All right, so these are some good, easy steps. Hopefully you guys really keep pushing after this, right? And really understand that this whole process is really something that's supposed to make you get closer to Christ. Something that's supposed to make you seek him more. Make you seek, because if you're going to have that faith and hope that it's all going to pan out, Jesus is the first piece of that foundation that's showing you it's going to work out. This is God. God has had a plan for thousands of years. It's going to work out. You're only worried about 2 years. What's coming in the next 4 years or 6 years? Jesus was covering for thousands of years. That makes sense. Our plan was from 6,000 years beyond. And then from there, the reason why you're even involved here is because that step paid off in 2,000 years. Does that make sense? So really you understand that it's not something you have to do alone. Jesus is going to walk alongside you. And you do not want to do it on your own, right? It's Jesus. You will definitely be overwhelmed. But that's where Jesus comes in. He says, I will help you. That's the whole reason why I came down, to help you see who God is, what he does, why he does what he does. And I was always in love.